The iPhone 16 is now out, and to call it disappointing would be an understatement. The iPhone started out as one of the most innovative pieces of technology in human history. Despite not being the first smartphone, its introduction in 2007 ushered in the era of smartphone reliance. It would only take a few years after its introduction for it to become commonplace for everyone to own a smartphone, with iPhone definitely being seen as the trendier option, far surpassing the market share of Samsung, Nokia, and other competitors. It's not unfair to say that the iPhone changed the world, and for many, the iPhone became their world. Sadly, in the past few years, the iPhone is barely even a shell of its former game-changing self. With the release of the iPhone 16, it's clear to see how Apple is now vastly outperformed by their competitors in terms of changes and upgrades. The once inspiring and innovative smartphone has become nothing more than a shameless cash grab, riding on the reputation established decades ago. Why did the iPhone turn into such an unremarkable smartphone compared to the dazzling marvel of modern technology it once was? Let's go back over a decade to the Generation 7 of iPhones. This generation contained the iPhone 5S, and Apple was still making major innovations to their phones at this point. When a new iPhone releases, it usually has some standard upgrades that come with every new edition, such as improved battery efficiency, better display, and an upgraded camera. Pretty much every new edition of iPhone will have those upgrades. But back then, every generation of iPhone would usually also have some other major upgrade. In the case of the iPhone 5S, it introduced Touch ID, which was a major innovation in the smartphone industry. Removing the need to type in your passcode every time you wanted to open your iPhone was an extremely convenient addition to the iPhone, and they were the first to do it. But it was around this time that Apple would start to lose the innovative reputation it had established for itself. However, with the next generation, Generation 8, they'd still continue to innovate, at least somewhat. Along with the usual upgrades, the iPhone 6 would have the ability to put your phone into low battery mode, which was met with extremely positive feedback, as it was something users had been requesting for a while. Even the iPhone 6 Plus wasn't too disappointing with its new features, with it being big enough to function almost as a mini iPad. Of course, this was still just a premium upgrade, but it could very well have been worth the money at the time. Moving on to Generation 9, the innovations continued. 3D Touch being introduced onto the iPhone 6S, despite already existing on the Apple Watch a year prior, had never been introduced onto a device like the iPhone before. The point is that up until now, Apple was always upgrading their technology, constantly jumping from big idea to steadily improve their phones to be better than the competition. No doubt thanks to Steve Jobs and his fierce dedication to innovating in the tech industry. But it's around now that Apple would really start to stagnate their improvements. To be fair to the 10th generation of iPhones, it wasn't entirely uninspired. The iPhone 7 did have some seriously increased waterproofing capabilities. Aside from that though, nothing new of significance was added. Funnily enough, Apple even started removing features from the iPhone. The 10th generation would remove the aux headphone jack from the bottom of the phones, a change that was extremely unpopular with customers, not only because it meant they couldn't connect their headphones to their phone anymore, but also because they now couldn't use their headphones and charge at the same time unless they were Bluetooth. This was a major burden for a lot of customers. Generation 11 kicked off with the fairly lackluster iPhone 8. There is really nothing notable about this edition of the iPhone. It's a fairly pointless addition to the roster, and the same goes for the 8 Plus. These iPhones added nothing of note and were clearly only placeholders for the release of the iPhone X. The iPhone X, in all fairness, wasn't a totally redundant phone in terms of innovation. The removal of the home button and the new sleek design was definitely something that made it worth the upgrade. However, one feature of note was the phone's Face ID system, a nice flashback to how innovative Apple used to be. Apple didn't invent the Face ID system. However, they created by far the most convenient, reliable, and foolproof system for it, since old Face ID systems use the 3D shape of your head using infrared cameras as opposed to the biometric data Apple uses. This is an example of Apple actually innovating, and unfortunately, not one we'd see a lot more of since. Generation 12 was a howler of a year for the iPhone. It saw the release of the iPhone XR and XS, and none of them introduced anything to justify the hundreds of dollars they released at. Nothing was special about these phones. Pretty much the only notable feature of these phones was the dual SIM compatibility, technology that was already nearly 2 decades old at this point, and not even an original innovation. It doesn't really help that this innovation wasn't particularly useful for most consumers, since most people just don't have any need or use for 2 SIM cards. Meanwhile, over at competitors Samsung, they were releasing a lot of new features for their impressively large lineup of phones. The Note got optimizations and Bluetooth working for its pens. The Galaxy S9 got its famous infinity display and super slow-mo recording, and even Huawei got AI-driven scene recognition technology for its P20. Even HTC came out with a new edge sense on the U12 Plus, allowing the sides of the phones to function as interactive buttons for apps. Once again, the competition innovates, while Apple provides nothing new. With Generation 13 and another set of releases with no noteworthy innovations, other companies were making groundbreaking innovations to their phones. The same year, Samsung would debut their folding smartphone in 2019. Even if this wasn't the most popular type of smartphone ever dreamt up, it's evidently successful enough for Samsung to continue releasing new models. This being the same year that Huawei continued being the affordable option and even introduced a new pop-up selfie camera on its Y9 Prime. Now you can see what's happening here. Apple continues to release very uninspired, run-of-the-mill copies of their older phones. Most of their new major updates are things like widget integration and home screen optimization, technology that's existed for years on Android and Google phones already. Even HTC, who were mostly marketing to be an affordable option in the year, came with fingerprint sensors on the back of their phones, which is a popular choice with consumers. You could at least have made the argument before that when Apple took ideas from competitors, they'd make them better or optimize them in some way. A great example of this being the iPhone itself. The iPhone was not the first smartphone to ever exist, but everything about the iPhone, the design, the convenience and interface, on top of the fact that it was backed by a tech giant that could distribute it widely, was basically Apple's own. Nowadays, that's not the case. The widget integration, which is one of the few major updates the iPhone has seen at all in the last years, isn't original and is the exact same as Samsung has already had for years at this point. It's been nearly 7 years since the release of the iPhone X, and by this point, Apple has already decided that instead of trying to beat their competition, they would just start mimicking them. But what is it that happened with Apple? Some people would say they simply realized that people will just always buy their new phones, which, while somewhat true, isn't the only reason as to why Apple has become so complacent with the iPhone. One major and often forgotten reason as to why Apple became as lazy as they are now could be due to the departure of Steve Jobs. His departure from Apple in 2011 marked a turning point for the company, and there were clear effects on its direction, culture, and innovation. Steve Jobs is famous for how revolutionary his ideas for Apple were, so his leaving was a major loss for the overall business structure. It was clear that Apple was missing something after Steve Jobs left. Their business ventures seemed like shots in the dark, gambles that needed a stroke of luck to work out. The introduction of printers and digital cameras were fruitless ventures. It's hard to believe that Steve Jobs would have spearheaded printers that were nothing special to compete with its competitors. These products lacked the distinctiveness and innovation that had defined Apple as a company up until now. As a result, once the ideas Steve Jobs had likely started development on were completed, we got significantly worse technology from Apple. Steve Jobs' importance to Apple is hard to understate. When he left for the first time in 1985, the company's stock price immediately declined, and it lost market share to up-and-coming competitors like Microsoft, who were rapidly innovating in a lot of rival markets like laptops and PCs. Even with Steve Jobs' return, by the mid-1990s, Apple was in serious trouble, with declining profits and a shrinking customer base. It got so bad that they nearly went bankrupt. The reason things went so poorly the first time, though, is because in 1985, Apple wasn't the tech giant we know today. A household name for sure, but nowhere near the market monster it is in the present era. By the time Steve Jobs left again, Apple was already a juggernaut in the tech industry. With his departure in 2011, the iPhone was already the market leader. People were ready to buy it no matter what. And this is why Apple is getting away with their laziness. People buy every new iPhone, every new watch, every new MacBook, regardless of what's actually new about it. Apple has long surpassed the need to innovate and challenge the limits of technology. As a business, their model of releasing a new phone every year or so works perfectly fine for them. Aside from people's false belief that Apple is still vastly ahead of the competition like it was a decade ago, a lot of demographics, especially children and the elderly, don't have a profound enough knowledge of technology to really grasp the difference between smartphones. That being said, a lot of people find the iPhone iPhone's layout more simple and aesthetically pleasing. Couple that with the iPhone's steadfast reputation, it isn't hard to piece together why people still want to buy the iPhone, even if it isn't as savvy or innovative as it was before. But Apple's new business model doesn't stop at just lazy, it's now actively malicious. Apple has by now had to pay out millions as a result of lawsuits after they deliberately slowed down older versions of their phones. It's not uncommon that if you have an iPhone that's a few years old, it just starts acting wonky, shutting off at 30%, lagging tremendously with normal use, or apps and integrations that just straight up stop working. This controversy might be familiar to you. However, the problem doesn't stop at Apple doing it entirely on purpose. When Apple releases new updates for their operating system, it more often than not significantly slows down older systems as Apple makes sure their updates only cater to the very newest version of the phone, meaning older versions just get slower and slower until they just break entirely. And if that wasn't daunting enough for you, what about Apple's repair policy? If you have a problem with your Samsung phone, you can basically get into it and fix it yourself if you have the know-how. When it comes to Apple though, it's an entire ordeal to get what you need to fix it. With every new phone, Apple keeps changing what you need to get into the phone yourself. If you repair an iPhone using spare parts that you yourself have bought, your iPhone simply won't cooperate with it. Apple wants to force you to use an official and certified repair shop to get your phone fixed, and that will sometimes cost you so much that you may as well just buy another phone. Despite Apple having taken steps to make your phone at least somewhat easier to repair, it's still extremely difficult as Apple uses its own screws, glue, and parts that are hard to get hold of without going through Apple's official channels. This all brings us back to the brand new, but at the same time old, iPhone 16, with nothing new or exciting about the phone's features, yet with the same hefty price tag. There's no end in sight for Apple's infinite greed. The age where the iPhone was a masterpiece of innovation has long ended, with new innovations barely ever being introduced by the company, unless of course they were just stolen. Chances are that Apple won't stop unless they see sales falling, and unfortunately, as it stands, that just seems unlikely. Interest for the new iPhone 16 is still absolutely massive, regardless of how disappointing it is from a technological standpoint, and it's sure to do incredible numbers in sales just because it's the new iPhone. Unless someone at Apple has a sudden epiphany, we can safely assume we won't be seeing anything exciting from the iPhone for a long, long time.